Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. John Wayne.
For millions, John Wayne wasn't simply a movie star. He was America itself. The fearless cowboy who always knew what was right, the towering hero who never backed away from danger, and the man whose deep voice became the soundtrack of an entire generation. On screen, he looked larger than life. Off screen, he was surrounded by fame, fortune, and some of the most beautiful women in Hollywood. But behind 3 marriages, whispered romances, and a lifetime spent chasing the next horizon, there was one woman whose memory never seemed to fade. The question wasn't who married John Wayne, it was who truly captured his heart. As the years slipped away and the Duke quietly reflected on the life he had lived, a pattern began to emerge, one that surprised even those who knew him best. Because sometimes the greatest love story isn't the one that lasts the longest. It's the one that never really ends. Before he became the Duke. Long before the world knew him as John Wayne, before the Academy Award, the legendary westerns, and the unmistakable swagger, he was simply Marion Robert Morrison, a tall, athletic young man growing up in Southern California with dreams that looked nothing like Hollywood. His friends didn't call him the Duke because he acted like a movie star. The nickname came from an oversized Airedale Terrier named Duke that followed him everywhere. Before long, people began calling the boy by the dog's name instead. It stuck. Years later, millions would know him by that nickname, never realizing it had begun with the loyal companionship of a family pet rather than a film studio. Life wasn't always easy. After his father struggled financially, the Morrison family found themselves moving more than once, forcing young Marion to leave behind familiar friends and start over. Those early disappointments quietly shaped him. He learned that security could disappear overnight, and that family meant everything when the world became uncertain. Football offered an escape. At Glendale High School, he became a standout athlete, earning a scholarship to the University of Southern California. For a while, it seemed his future would be built on the football field, not in front of movie cameras. But fate had different plans. A body surfing accident seriously injured his shoulder, ending any realistic hope of a football career. The scholarship disappeared, and suddenly, the future he had imagined vanished almost overnight. To pay the bills, Marion found work at local film studios. At first, it wasn't glamorous. He carried props, moved furniture, and worked behind the scenes, watching actors become heroes beneath the bright California lights. Few people noticed the quiet young man doing the heavy lifting. One person did. Director John Ford saw something others overlooked. A commanding presence, natural confidence, and a face the camera seemed to trust. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Years of small roles, forgotten appearances, and hard lessons followed before Marion Morrison finally became John Wayne. Yet while Hollywood slowly built its next superstar, something far more important was unfolding away from the cameras. At dances, family gatherings, and quiet evenings with friends, a young Latina woman from a respected Los Angeles family had begun catching his attention. She wasn't drawn to the Hollywood dream because there wasn't one yet. She knew him before the fame, before the money, before millions of fans believed he could never fail. She fell in love with Marion, not John Wayne, and decades later, many would quietly wonder whether that simple truth explained everything that came after. The woman who loved Marion, not the Duke. The wedding photographs tell a story Hollywood never could. There are no flashing cameras, no red carpets, no crowds chanting his name. Just a young man with hopeful eyes standing beside Josephine Saenz, the woman who believed in him before the world knew who he was. In 1933, when they exchanged vows, John Wayne wasn't yet a legend. To Josephine, he wasn't even John Wayne. He was still Marion Morrison, the ambitious young man she imagined growing old with. For a time, that dream felt real. They built a home, welcomed 4 children, and tried to create the ordinary family life they both wanted. But while Josephine was building a family, Hollywood was quietly building an icon. Then, in 1939, Stagecoach changed everything. Almost overnight, the struggling actor became one of America's brightest new stars. The offers multiplied. So did the time spent away from home. Success gave John Wayne everything he had worked for. It also began taking away the life he'd already built. Film sets replaced family dinners. Months apart became routine. Josephine found herself raising their children while her husband rode across Monument Valley or filmed on distant locations. Neither of them planned for the marriage to drift apart. It happened slowly, hidden inside busy schedules, growing fame, and the impossible demands placed on Hollywood's newest leading man. Friends would later remember that Josephine never wanted the movie star. She wanted the man she had married before fame changed his world. By 1945, their marriage had ended, closing a chapter neither had expected to lose. The women who could never replace home. Hollywood had finally given John Wayne everything he thought he wanted. The marriage was over. His career was soaring. Every new film made him a bigger star than the last. To the outside world, the Duke looked unstoppable. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the applause faded, the silence waiting at home felt louder than ever. Then came Marlene Dietrich. They met while filming Seven Sinners, and from the very beginning, sparks were impossible to ignore. Marlene was unlike anyone John had ever known. Brilliant, glamorous, fiercely independent, and completely at ease inside Hollywood's dazzling world. Their romance became one of the industry's worst-kept secrets. Years later, John would still speak of her with unmistakable admiration. Yet for all the passion they shared, something always seemed to hold him back. Loving Marlene was exciting, but it never felt like home. She wasn't the only woman who entered his life during those restless years. Biographers have also described a long-running, discreet relationship with Merle Oberon, whose elegance and quiet confidence offered John a welcome escape from the relentless spotlight. Then there was Maureen O'Hara, the fiery red-haired co-star whose remarkable chemistry with John convinced generations of moviegoers they belonged together. O'Hara always insisted they were only close friends, though some later biographers believed their bond ran much deeper. Whatever the truth, their loyalty to one another endured long after the cameras stopped rolling. Years later, after separating from Pilar, John found comfort in Pat Stacey, the former secretary who remained faithfully beside him during his painful battle with cancer. She cared for the man the world rarely saw, the aging Marion Morrison hidden beneath the legend of John Wayne. Each woman offered him something different: passion, understanding, friendship, companionship. Yet none could give him the one thing he seemed to spend the rest of his life searching for, the quiet sense of home he had lost long before Hollywood ever called him the Duke. The woman he thought would replace the past. She was everything Josephine wasn't. Where Josephine had been quiet and deeply rooted in family life, Esperanza Bauer was glamorous, passionate, and impossible to overlook. The beautiful Mexican actress entered John Wayne's life at a moment when he desperately wanted to believe that love could begin again. Their whirlwind romance moved quickly, and in 1946, barely a year after his divorce, they were married. To the outside world, it looked like a fresh start. Behind closed doors, it became something very different. Both carried emotional scars into the marriage. John was trying to rebuild a life that fame had helped unravel. Esperanza was entering a world where she would forever be compared to one of Hollywood's biggest stars. The pressures were immense, and before long, admiration gave way to insecurity. Hollywood gossip only made matters worse. As John's career continued climbing, rumors linking him to actresses appeared with unsettling regularity. Whether justified or not, they fueled arguments that became increasingly difficult to calm. Friends later recalled a marriage marked by intense emotions, jealousy, and painful misunderstandings. Stories of explosive confrontations followed them, painting a picture of two people who cared deeply but struggled to trust each other. John had spent years riding fearless heroes across movie screens. At home, he couldn't outride disappointment. By the early 1950s, the marriage had become impossible to save. Their divorce in 1954 brought relief more than celebration, ending a relationship that had never found the stability both had hoped for. Yet something quietly stood out to those who knew him. Even after 2 marriages had failed, John rarely spoke with resentment about Josephine. The bitterness that surrounded his second marriage was absent whenever his first wife entered the conversation. It was as though one chapter remained filled with regret, while the other remained filled with gratitude. John Wayne still believed love was waiting somewhere ahead. What he didn't know was that the woman who would stay with him the longest was about to enter his life. But even she would eventually discover that some memories are impossible to compete with. The woman who stayed but could never replace the past. The first thing John Wayne noticed wasn't her beauty. It was her calm. In 1953, while filming The High and the Mighty, John met Pilar Pallete, a young Peruvian actress whose quiet confidence stood in striking contrast to the chaos that had filled much of his personal life. She wasn't chasing Hollywood fame, and she wasn't intimidated by the man millions called the Duke. For perhaps the first time in years, John found himself enjoying something he'd almost forgotten: peace. After his divorce from Esperanza, their relationship deepened, and in 1954, they married. Friends believed he'd finally found the stability he'd been searching for. For a while, it seemed they were right. Pilar gave birth to 3 children, and together they built a home far removed from the constant glare of movie premieres and studio politics. Unlike his previous marriage, this one wasn't defined by public drama. Instead, it was shaped by patience, compromise, and the understanding that loving John Wayne also meant sharing him with the career he could never abandon. But Hollywood has a way of demanding more than anyone expects. As the years passed, John's relentless filming schedule returned. Location shoots stretched across months. Public appearances multiplied. Even as age and illness began slowing him physically, work remained the center of his life. Pilar later acknowledged that their marriage gradually became one of long separations rather than constant companionship. Though they remained husband and wife, they eventually chose to live largely independent lives while never officially ending their marriage. Yet something about John never changed. Those closest to him noticed that when conversations drifted back to the earliest days of his life, his memories often carried a different warmth. Before the fame, before the headlines, before Hollywood became everything, those moments almost always began with Marion Morrison and with Josephine. Perhaps Pilar gave John Wayne the longest chapter of his life. But length and permanence are not always the same thing. As the Duke entered his final years, battling illness and looking back on a life few could imagine, the answer to the question that had quietly followed him for decades finally began to reveal itself. The love that time never erased. Old age has a way of changing the questions we ask. For John Wayne, the final years weren't spent chasing another blockbuster or proving he was still Hollywood's toughest cowboy. After years of battling cancer, countless surgeries, and a body worn down by decades of demanding film work, the man who had once seemed larger than life became increasingly reflective. Friends noticed it. So did members of his family. The conversations became less about the next movie, and more about the road behind him. By then, John had known passion. He had known heartbreak. He had known the comfort of companionship, but memory has its own rules. Again and again, those closest to him observed that when he spoke about the happiest, simplest years of his life, his stories almost always returned to the time before he became the Duke, before the endless travel, before the pressure of superstardom, before Hollywood claimed more of his life than he had ever intended to give. Those memories almost always included Josephine. Not because their marriage had been perfect. It wasn't. Fame had placed burdens on their relationship that neither of them fully understood at the time. But she had known the young man before the legend existed. She loved Marion Morrison when success was only a dream, and that kind of love is almost impossible to recreate once the world begins treating a man as an icon instead of a husband. John Wayne never publicly declared that Josephine was the greatest love of his life. History doesn't give us that confession. What it does reveal is something quieter, and perhaps even more meaningful. Through his own reflections, through the memories shared by those who knew him, and through the remarkable tenderness with which he continued to speak of his first wife, a picture slowly emerges. Some loves end on paper. Others simply change shape and remain with us for the rest of our lives. John Wayne built a legacy that transformed American cinema forever. Yet behind the cowboy hat, the unforgettable voice, and the fearless heroes he portrayed, there remained one private truth that fame could never rewrite. Sometimes, the person who captures your heart forever is the one who knew you before the world did. John Wayne spent a lifetime convincing the world that courage meant never looking back. On screen, he always rode toward the next horizon. But in real life, Even the strongest men carry memories they can never leave behind. His story reminds us that fame can build a legend, but it cannot protect a marriage, erase regret, or replace a first love that helped shape the person we became. Whether you believe Josephine was the one who truly held his heart, one thing is certain. Behind the legend of the Duke was a man whose greatest battles were never fought in front of a camera. If this story brought back memories of John Wayne or Hollywood's golden age, let us know your favorite John Wayne film in the comments. And if you enjoy these untold stories from classic Hollywood, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next journey through cinematic history.